States. My problem is with Wall Street, not with Silicon Valley. There's a libertarian streak that runs through Silicon Valley that frightens me. I mean, it's just fundamentally selfish.
We're a startup, we have no credit. We were just 6-7 guys sitting until 1 a.m. every day on our laptops shipping books.
Oh, I think there's a lot of things to do to, I think, open the perspective of the Japanese animation industry, and also just to toward women.
It has pulled forward 5 years of digital transformation in 5 months. You know, it's not the S&P 500, it's the S&P 5.
When you're struggling those early days, you could also do anything. And that was the beauty too. We could try things.
An intelligence, in this case, an algorithm, ingests and learns from and evolves. And I just found it so fascinating because that literally could be the meaning of life right there.
And that is a wrap. So, hi everyone. Today we have a very special guest on the podcast. We have become quick friends, and one of the folks who has inspired me in a very short period of time. And that person is Bob Garfield. He is a very well-known journalist. He is part of NPR. He's a very well-known political author. His most recent book is called The American Manifesto, which really delves into how did we get into the current state of affairs with partisan politics, and why is the country so divided? And what stood out for me that was very interesting is I consider Bob as one of the last dying generation of true investigative journalists. You know, folks who cared about the mission, not so much about the clicks and the views and the impressions and the monetization, which is very rare. So he's part of that generation, and we're going to spend time talking about and really exploring his work and why is democracy important, what led to the partisanship and the state of affairs as they are today, and also, some interesting insights that Bob has seen over the years. So with that, Bob, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Daniel. It's a pleasure. I see you're from the background. You're calling me from Montreal, which is, as I understand it, in Canada, and it's one of my favorite parts of North America. Oh, Canada, glorious and free. We stand on guard. We stand on guard for thee.
Wow, I'm impressed, Bob.
Well, they say Renaissance man. I don't think that's quite true. I think it's more like, late Middle Ages. But I just want to tell you one thing before we get started. I have a camera in my computer monitor. We all do, but mine's on the bottom perimeter, on the bottom border, which means that there is no way for me to look in your virtual eyes as I talk if I'm not going to be looking like this thing here. And so that's one thing. And the second thing is the camera angle looks like something from Leni Riefenstahl, Nazi Germany propaganda films.
Perfect.
And that I'm not going. That's not the vibe I'm attempting. So I just apologize for the whole, vibe.
Yeah, no, not at all. In terms of the camera, it actually looks like you're looking straight to me, so that's fine. And you look like a Bond villain, so that's even better.
Thank you.
So on that note, Bob, let's jump right in. And we were having this conversation. We've had several conversations around there is something deeply troubling about the state of affairs in America, especially in terms of civic education and politics, and that democracy is in trouble. Can you talk a bit about that?
Sure. There's two ways to come to the conclusion democracy is in trouble. One is to look at the current administration in Washington, which is using extra democratic methods to achieve its political will, or to impose its political will, extra constitutional, extra judicial, extra democratic, and in some cases, in other cases, using the levers of actual democracy in order to further an autocratic end. So that's not good. And so there's the facts on the ground that suggest the idea that democracy is under attack from at the highest levels of our government. That's number one. The second thing is, the reason I know democracy is in trouble is because the public says it is. I can't at the moment just cite chapter and verse, but I can tell you there are very large studies and public opinion polls, all which lead to the same observation, which is that increasingly Americans, especially younger ones, Gen Z and millennials, are so fed up and so disappointed by the way American democracy has turned out, with all its economic inequality and its social injustice, the 1% having undue influence and undue percentage of the wealth. They're like, let's try something else. 30% of the people under 30 believe that they're willing to give something else a try, and including, according to survey results, a strong leader and army rule.
Wow.
Army rule.
Wow.
Military junta running the United States of America. So that's scary on the face of it. And this is not to say that people have no reason to be disappointed on the left or on the right.
Right.
But the fact is, there's a lot of people who are willing to throw out the democracy baby with the political frustration bathwater.
So what do you think led to this? Like, why are we in this state right now? What happened?
Well, there's two things. The first thing is reality. Let's say you're aligned somewhere on the political left. You have grown up in your whole life, you have watched, if this is what you're watching for, you have watched wealth be concentrated among a very tiny percentage of the public, which is mostly Silicon Valley billionaires and the banking class, the Wall Street class, where money is made but wealth isn't really created. It's just you're watching them as parasites feeding on the economic activity of others without actually creating anything for the society.
You consider
whether it's infrastructure or stability or what have you. They're leeches. So and then you look at the way the rest of the 99% live, and you see all sorts of economic insecurity. You see the young generations facing the likelihood that when they finish their schooling,
right,
whether it's high school or college, that they cannot look forward to having a career in one place or even in one industry, and that pays them salary and pays for their health care and pays for puts money away for their retirement and generally gives them the upward mobility that all previous generations have had virtually guaranteed to them. So another way of saying it, and I am going to quote Aristotle because he was such a great thinker so many millennia ago. The Gen Z is fucked. They are completely fucked. The society has let them down. And so that's one reason to be disappointed with democracy. And you see that the legislative branch has been bought and paid for by special interests, whether it's the gun lobby or the energy lobby or the pharma lobby or the healthcare lobby for their entire lives. And they know that while we nominally have a functioning democracy, that it has been highly, highly corrupted. So that's that side of the spectrum. The other side, if you're on the political right, you see a society that since World War II has gradually made what I call improvements to the society, establishing social justice, removing discrimination, removing barriers to success, legislatively and judicially eradicating impediments to just basic freedom for women, for people of color, for LGBT, even for people accused of a crime, which is pretty fundamental here. You know, we're all innocent until proven guilty, and we have our rights. Even the very Miranda decision that enabled people accused of a crime to be treated fairly, uh, that that along with taking the prayer out of the schools, the Roe v. Wade, if you're on the political right and a social conservative, you believe that your America over the course of the last 50 or 60 years has been gradually taken away from you. And immigration has changed the demographics of the society so that very, very soon in the next 4 or 5 years, white people will no longer be the majority in the United States of America. The aggregation of all other demographics will exceed the population of white people. And they feel like they're the victims of an invasion. They're not. What they are is living in a country that has always grown by immigration and improved and enriched itself. That is to say, culturally enriched, but also financially enriched itself because of, for want of another term, new blood that keeps coming in and putting down roots and building communities and so on. So, but
Right.
that's what they think. So on the right, they think it's been taken away from them due to just the 60 years of social justice. And on the left, they think that it's all just kind of it's all just a facade for what is a structural inequality that no legislation and no Supreme Court ruling has ever been able to undo. How's that?
Yeah, that's a great start, and I want to unpack a few points. One of them is
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I don't know who all is seeing this and who's just hearing it, but I turned 60 5 years ago, and I had some friends threw a party for me, and my
Nice.
son-in-law's sister bought me this present. She stopped into a gift shop on the way to my party. It's not something she gave a lot of thought to, but this is what it says.
That's hilarious.
I love this mug so much because it's just so wrong on absolutely every level.
And that's what makes it so right at the same
Yeah.
time.
So I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, not at all. So let's unpack a few things. Let's start at the beginning where you mentioned both Silicon Valley and Wall Street are leeches to society. They're just sucking wealth out. My counterpoint would be is the finance industry, I agree, is built on arbitrage. It's not so much about value creation. It's more about making sure you have information, you can make the trades, you can leverage and then leverage some more, and when things go wrong, hope for a bailout. At the same time, I also understand the need for financial capital for, quite frankly, modern civilization to exist. So I don't think anyone's arguing with that. On the other end, you mentioned Silicon Valley, and I may have a bit of a bias here, being an entrepreneur. But you do see, especially the US, we've lagged so far behind in terms of infrastructure, and the rest of the world is catching up. The traditional corporate America, which is not Silicon Valley, but more and more it's becoming that, hasn't done so. Silicon Valley, whether it's Tesla cars, whether it's solar panels, whether it's going back to, I have a friend who's working on a fusion reactor, right? All these interesting technologies, SpaceX, let's make rockets reusable. Isn't that a good thing?
I was going to interrupt you when you got started, but I wanted to hear you make that case. Not because I'm going to challenge it. I'm not. Actually, I, in general terms, my problem is with Wall Street, not with Silicon Valley. I was just pointing out that a whole lot of wealth is concentrated there. Now, so I think some of the billionaires as individuals are kind of douchey, and I think
Agree.
I think there's a libertarian streak that runs through Silicon Valley that frightens me because it's just fundamentally selfish, from my perspective.
Fundamentally selfish?
Yeah, I think, I've gotten kind of radicalized over the years, but I found myself after years of being kind of a wishy-washy moderate Democrat type, although I'm not a Democrat, I'm not affiliated with any political party, but let's just say New Left. I have moved farther and farther left, and now I believe something in a political system much closer to Denmark than anything that our system looks like, with high marginal tax rates and absolute guarantees that everybody in society will be taken care of to some minimum threshold, and that you can still be governed by the profit. The society and the economy are still governed by the profit motive, but that there is heavy government regulation to make sure that the free market doesn't get out of hand, because, one of the things the free market is free of is conscience. And we have cops on the beat. We have cops on the beat in our cities to make sure nobody conks anybody else on the head. And yet, the conservative, the GOP here in this country, the Republicans, want to take the cops off of the beat and corporate regulation, which I think is loathsome. So, as far as Silicon Valley is concerned, though, no, they do create value. They do create wealth. So, maybe from an ideological or philosophical point of view, I question their values, but I don't question that they have added value. Putting aside the dystopian effect of certain technology,
of course,
that nobody could have probably anticipated.
That's a good point. And maybe some insight to share on that is not all the Silicon Valley billionaires are aligned. There's very competing point of views. One is obviously, and I would put contrarian viewpoint out of it, because most entrepreneurs are contrarian by general. They see the world and they want to change it. How they choose to change it, that's where the diversity comes in. So on one end, you have folks like, as you mentioned, the Peter Thiel school of thought, which is, let's throw in the Molotov cocktail, let's, by supporting Trump, and let's see what comes out of it. Because the system is inherently, rigged, and it's not working. So there's that saying, right? The road to hell is paved with good intentions. So that's one point of view. But then the other point of view, and I know one of those Silicon Valley billionaires, become good friends, where he is deeply worried about the growing strength and influence of a few companies. It's being very concentrated, like Facebook, Amazon. And we often forget that in the 80s, there was this huge movement around the internet, and in 90s especially. So there is a movement in Silicon Valley that wants the internet to be free, because that's the last sort of decentralized bastion that's out of the purview of the government, out of the purview of corporations completely. So again, my point is that there's a diversity of influence. There's a diversity of opinions. You will be right at home with several entrepreneurs there, and you would get glances from others. And I think maybe that's what makes humanity interesting. We just have diversity of point of view. I want to move on to, you mentioned the police state and police brutality and so on, and why the system is so unfair, and wanted to get your insights around that, because recently we've had this issue where you've had a African American runner who's just running around the neighborhood. Back in February, you have this retired cop and so on, chases him down, they shoot him, video is captured, nothing happens. And finally, it took civil society to act, and then get justice delivered, which again, we'll talk about later on around our democracy and why civic education is important. But that makes a good case why citizens have to, fight for their rights. What are your thoughts around this? Why does this happen in the US so much?
That story has so many dimensions to it. But let's just, for the moment, the story, the alibi or the explanation by the guys who shot him is that they thought he was a guy who had been committing burglaries in the neighborhood, so they decided to intervene as citizens. Okay, let's just say, no disrespect meant to this man, I'm just saying this is a hypothetical. Let's just say he was a burglar. Let's just say he had been robbing the shit out of all this guy's neighbors. To the best of my knowledge, the penalty for burglary, once it is processed in the court system, is not capital punishment. It is certainly not instant capital punishment.
There's
So
not.
there is no explanation that these guys have proffered that, or could proffer, that justifies them executing some sort of vigilante justice from their truck on a country road. None. Zero. So no matter how you process this, even if this young man was Satan himself, this is wrong. So let's start there. Of course, in all probability, he was just a guy out for a job. And they, in all probability, they, for their own reasons, and it doesn't take a whole lot of imagination to imagine what those reasons are, just decided to assign guilt to him because they felt that he was suspicious. And then, of course, they had guns, and they had them legally open in public because that's what the gun lobby has done to this country, and incredibly normalized the idea of open carry, where everybody can walk around with military weapons and or assault weapons anyway. And it's just astonishing on that level alone as well. But the larger issue is why? Well, it comes down to that he's black. You know, he was guilty of jogging while black. And despite all of those remarkable legislative victories and judicial decisions, which have, at least on a legal basis, restored some measure of our founding rights as Americans, some measure of them to communities of color, the fact is that racism still undergirds almost everything that goes on in our society every day. And if you're skeptical of that, ask a black friend what it's like to go to an upscale store and just browse. Just ask him what it's like to have people eyeing him or her, following him or her in the aisles. Ask them how many times they've been stopped for a tail light. Ask them how many times they've been perhaps even asked to get out of the car, because there is a different set of justice for blacks and whites in this country. And you know, there have been improvements because we do have rule of law now, and the law favors justice, but reality doesn't favor justice. Reality favors racism. So that's another disturbing dimension of what happened with this guy. A third one you alluded to, which is the fact that it took civil society to kick into action for anyone to even know about it. Well, the good news is we now have these cell phone videos everywhere that captures the kind of police brutality and sometimes homicide that hitherto nobody ever saw. I mean, this is a development in the last 10 years. And so we now have it in our face all the time. We're seeing police violence to a degree that we have never seen it before. It was always in the shadows, which probably exaggerates the amount that it's actually happening, because we see so much of it before our very eyes. But the interesting thing is, the question isn't whether it exaggerates our sense of how often it's happening. What's interesting is that a week doesn't go by where one of these videos doesn't emerge. So it's happening way too much for all of our achievements as a society. Way too much, which means we haven't addressed it. But the point I was trying to get to is, because our newspaper industry and our news media, because their business model has imploded, thanks to Silicon Valley. Thanks a lot, guys.
Well, Silicon Valley also helped with the camera phones and smartphones. So thank you for that as well.
That's true. Thank you, Silicon Valley, for the for the body cams. Fuck you, Facebook, for sapping the media economy dry.
It's hilarious.
So anyway, the newspaper, we have lost, and this is a key element of our democracy. Newspapers are supposed to be watchdogs of the society, especially the government. But in the last 20 years, 1/3 of American newspapers has closed, shut its doors, turned off the lights, stopped the presses, and it just doesn't exist. And vast parts of this country are in news deserts where there is literally no way to get any local news. And among other very deleterious effects of that is that while the cat's away, the mice do play. And
Right.
and we're all very much in the dark.
So again, I guess we're going to go level 3 now, unpack level 2. And a few things stood out. One of them is when you mentioned that ask any, a black friend of yours when they went to an upscale, store and so on. It was fascinating you mentioned because I was speaking to a vice provost of a pretty well-known university who's African American. And I was shocked when we were having a dinner and he mentioned that, Daniel, my son, when he's driving late at night, and I tell him that if a cop pulls you over, you look down, you don't look them in the eye, and you say, "Yes, sir." And I was like, "You're kidding me." He's like, "Nope." And this person is a very well-known vice provost, a highly respected individual, and so on. So I feel you on that, and that was shocking for me because you don't realize that, right? In 2020, that these things would be happening, but they happen again and again. The second point that you mentioned, I thought that was very interesting, was the newspaper industry and the decline of the industry itself. And part of this is natural, meaning that's part of how civilizations evolve. We get different kinds of aspects that can go on and off. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think my thought is the one you just articulated. We got so used to the advertiser-supported media model because it lasted 290 years, and it's there's still little glimmers of it out there, and because of Procter and Gamble and United Airlines and the local dry cleaner wanting to reach mass audiences, they used mass media to do that, and it worked out well for everybody. The advertisers got an audience for their messages. The publishers got filthy rich because they were operating mostly in monopoly marketplaces, and the readers, the viewers, the listeners, got free or heavily subsidized content. They got that stuff for free. When the Beatles showed up on Ed Sullivan's show, when the men walked on the moon, when 9/11 happened, when I Love Lucy and Mr. Ed and Survivor were on TV, we didn't pay a penny. And it was a really nice ecosystem. 290 years it flourished, but it wasn't handed to us by God. It's not a part of the natural world. It's not Newtonian physics. It's not a given. And every part of the economy and every part of technology is vulnerable to being eventually obsoleted or disintermediated by better technology. And the internet, among its more utopian aspects, is a better technology. And for advertisers especially, because in the old days, let's just say you were selling running shoes. Well, you'd advertise in Runner's World, okay? And you had some reason to believe that the people who were reading Runner's World were runners, so they're going to buy their sneakers. And by the same token, if you're selling Jell-O pudding pops, the two places you're probably going to go is magazines that reach moms who do most of the shopping, and TV right. that reaches kids who are the consumers, right? And the media that you were advertising in were a proxy for the audience that you were trying to reach. They weren't perfect, but it was a decent proxy, and they had software that tried to maximize their targeting, right? But it was very, very rough. Then all of a sudden comes the internet, where Facebook, for example, as you know, Daniel, Facebook knows more about you by far than you know about you, because you've been telling it, you've been liking, you've been sharing, you've been uh, joining certain fan groups, you've been signaling every aspect. Sometimes you fill out quizzes if you're really naive. You've given them insight into every aspect of your personality that may not even be clear to you. And when they go to the Jello Pudding Pops people, when the Jello Pudding Pops people come to them, they know exactly who the target is for Jello Pudding Pops, because they know what people eat. So, so
Right.
that's way better. So, why, if you're an advertiser, if you're General Foods or whoever the hell owns Jello Pudding Pops, why the hell would you go into Good Housekeeping magazine, if such a thing exists? Or why would you advertise on, Saturday morning cartoons, if you can go directly to the person who has a deep pudding pop history and deep expressed interest in creamy desserts?
So
So,
this rabbit hole actually goes much deeper than that. Um, and I know we had this discussion prior where there's this emerging field of what we call computational social science. And, we spoke about Cambridge Analytica, and we also spoke about another experiment that we're running, but for good, um, in the higher education industry. But just for our viewers, just to share, it's no longer about understanding and targeting, which is what you were mentioning. That's level one. We're past that. Now it's about nudging and influencing your behavior. So a quick example of this is um, something has happened in the past 20 to 30 years that never happened before in human history. Meaning, for the first time at scale, we have vast amounts of human behavioral data, which we never had before. And so it's brought up this resurgence in the social sciences, especially psychology, once again, where given enough data, you can potentially, assuming within a certain deterministic model, you can potentially influence behavior. We already know, for example, crowd behavior and mobs sort of have this hive mind versus as an individual. We see this in sports psychology, and so on. And the fact that Facebook and these platforms can understand your basic psychology, and what they're using is the big five, which is, across all social sciences agreed upon as sort of that your personality trait is more or less consistent upon. Um, and so to give you a concrete example, there is an algorithm out there that just needs around 12 to 15 variables of your activity on Facebook can determine what your big five personality traits look like. And then they can target a certain message for you. And the example was one cosmetics company um, basically hired this algorithm and this team to do something similar where they wanted to sell the same lipstick. It's the same product. The Facebook and the algorithms figured out this section is introverted, this section is extroverted. For the extrovert women, it sent out have the best night of your life, right? But for the introvert women, it gave a message, unleash your inner beauty. And I kid you not, the conversions were almost 200% higher than just targeting, as you said. So we're going into this world where it's not just about targeting you, it's about tweaking and nudging you in subtle ways. That's basically a marketer's wet dream, if I may say so.
and unfortunately a politician's. So this has all come very nicely together. I started talking about Facebook to talk about how it's undercut the media economy, but it has also had devastating effects in the political culture. You mentioned Cambridge Analytica, and this is a reference to the British company which used Facebook data to target people in the during the 2016 election period. Often with political propaganda, actual fake news that was really fake, not news that Trump called fake, not actual news that Trump called fake, actual fakes that they were purporting to be news. And they used it to create anger and resentment in certain among those of certain political ideologies, and they were able to target these messages, and then nature took its course, and people shared very heavily and propagated all sorts of lies and conspiracy theories and put a bellows to the flames of resentment of the sort that I was describing to you earlier. And we were talking about utopian, dystopian. This is the dystopian part of technology, because by going to this next level of understanding behavior and actually influencing it, who knows whether it influenced the election. We do know it was there, and we know these messages were widely shared, and we do know that they were confused as truthful as opposed to the propaganda that they were, and we know that Donald Trump won at least the electoral vote. So, and it hasn't stopped. No.
Right.
And we also know that Facebook has done very, very, very little to fight this. They were nominally cooperative with the Senate investigators and the academic investigations that tried to get to the bottom of Cambridge Analytica and the rest of the 2016 election cycle. But Facebook withheld a whole lot of data, and they have done very little in the intervening 3.5 years to fix the structural problems which go right to the heart of their algorithm, which are, of course, the basis for their business model. And this is where I lose any sympathy for Facebook. I understand that they provide a much better mousetrap for brands trying to reach people for
Right.
advertising. But their response to the abuse of their algorithm is not, well, it can only be explained one way. They are so concerned with their business model and the growth that this algorithm has given them that they will not fix it in a substantial way or police it, even when the future of democracy is at stake, even when lives are at stake. Because here, okay, the Republican got elected instead of the Democrat. In Myanmar, there were pogroms of Buddhists against Muslims, which is the idea of radical Buddhists. Makes me laugh, but it's not funny if you were murdered based on false Facebook messages. And the company has been disgraceful, and that's why I've often said that Donald Trump is not the most powerful and dangerous man in the world. Mark Zuckerberg is the most powerful and dangerous man in the world, and he's done nothing but spin out pieties and empty promises. And Facebook has gone from being a utility with some dystopian aspects to one of the great problems in our world, and a huge threat to democracy.
Perhaps let's go to level 5 now, and let's try and understand what's going through Facebook's mind, right? And Mark Zuckerberg. And this is something I've been thinking about for a few years, also speaking to folks being in the industry itself. On one end, if you were to ask, let's say, someone like Noam Chomsky, he's probably not going to be surprised that this is happening. And Facebook response is more, hey, we're agnostic, right? How are we any worse than, let's say, the traditional media, CNN or Fox, where they actually do take a stance, right? We're okay. It doesn't matter who puts an ad, whether you're right or you're left, and all the spectrums in between. We have no problem, right? And we don't want to get into this. We don't want to interfere. And I think part of this challenge is two things. First one is, and this goes way back, I mean, understanding the founders, for example, Mark Zuckerberg, his view on privacy, he doesn't value privacy as an important construct. He values other people's privacy, but for him, the network is more important. And so this was an insight shared to me by the founder of Gmail. And he said something around the lines of, there is something called a founder to market fit, which is very important. Meaning, Google is all about building compelling products, interesting products, and they will do whatever they need to do. And that's just sort of Larry and Sergey, to improve that experience. So for example, if you go on Google's main page, that is like the number one real estate on the internet. There's no ads, there's nothing. All you see is a search bar, right? And then you had companies like Yahoo and so on with their banner ads and display ads, and they were like, no, that's a terrible user experience. We're engineers, so we're going to build just text, and it has to be relevant to what you search for. Otherwise, you will never see it, right? So they're foregoing profit to a certain degree. But that's how Google's wired. Facebook, for example, how they think about product is, and I can share it by giving an example. One of the most wanted features and desired features for years has been who's seen my profiles and who's seen my pictures, right? People pay a lot of money for that. But Facebook will never do that, simply because it's not about the best user experience or what users want. It's about the network. They will always optimize the network, because once you start monetizing that, it breaks down the network, right? People will be less hesitant to look at other people's photos and so on. So that breaks down the network and degrades it. So once you understand how people are thinking, then it starts becoming more and more predictable. So I'm not surprised why Facebook is doing what they're doing, because they value the network first. Everything else is secondary.
Yeah, well, that is a good insight. But all I can say is I can refer to an expression that popped up in the early 80s when AIDS was just beginning to emerge and ravaging mostly gay populations, mostly in big cities, but eventually everywhere in the world. And there was controversy in the gay community because some people didn't want to talk about it. And
Interesting.
and because they were afraid it was going to have, they were at varying degrees of out, and they didn't want to take up the cudgel because they were afraid that would make them vulnerable to whatever the society might inflict on them because they're gay. And the expression was silence equals death.
Right.
Being agnostic may, on the face of it, seem like a morally comfortable space to inhabit, but it isn't. Being agnostic, when let's put it this way, some people think of Switzerland during World War II and they go, oh yeah, what a great country, great cheese, great chocolate, clocks to die for. Oh, and they were neutral.
Yeah.
You can't be neutral against evil. That's not neutrality. That's a choice. And Mark Zuckerberg's and Facebook's agnosticism isn't neutrality, it's a choice. And the choice they have made is to value the growth of their network over the health and safety of the entire world. And that's bullshit.
No, I hear you. And as a political science student, that was my third major, appeasement didn't work, right? That's what the Allies did initially. Britain, after Poland, it didn't work. Germany just kept on going and going and going. And
Yeah,
that
Neville
led to
Chamberlain
World War
came
II.
back to the parliament. He said, peace in our time. We have peace in our time. He negotiated with Hitler, and they negotiated a mutual non-aggression pact. How did that work out?
No, I could not agree with you more. So here's the other interesting thing, and this is where, again, as we mentioned, that diversity in Silicon Valley and amongst human beings. Another interesting character is Steve Jobs, right? He is libertarian to a certain degree, and one approach that Apple has taken, which is different than Facebook, is they're very big on security, to the point that they're fighting, in recent years, the FBI. We're not giving up the data, right? Go to hell, we're not. And I was talking to this to an author where he was very big on Google, and I tried to explain to him, well, if you value your privacy, I would choose Apple over Google any day. And part of this is the influence of Steve Jobs, obviously, but the other part is understand, just work through where the money is coming from. Google makes money and Facebook makes money through ads, through selling your data. Apple makes money through providing you products and good experiences. And it's not in Apple's inherent interest to do that, right? So again, bringing it down to first principles often helps people understand why we do what we do. But I want to move this conversation forward. And this is why I love having you here, Bob, because you've seen so much history and you've seen history unfold. So so you laugh.
I'm going to say thank you, but
Yeah.
I think you've just said, Bob, I like having you here because you're so fucking old and you haven't died yet. Not yet, but let's squeeze some knowledge out of you, while you still walk the earth. Now, thanks, Daniel. That's well.
And being pragmatic, I'll take that and I'll double down on that, because I think it's fundamentally important. Because especially for the younger generation, we have all these global issues now, and without perspective and context, it'll be more of the same. And one question that came up, you were mentioning about, in the 80s with HIV and the LGBT community and how it was very hidden. Again, 2020 feels like, wow, what a weird time that was. Like, really? You couldn't speak out about it? It seems really strange. What do you think today the trends are moving towards, in the sense that we have this movement that, I call it could potentially be the last gasp of a dying generation per se, where they want things to go back. And then you have a very active movement on the other end that wants to push things radically forward, right? And usually it's sort of this amalgamation of these two different streams where we find where humanity is going to be. It's never in the middle. It could be wherever. But how do you see this unfolding? Like, how do you see the issues with, let's say, Trump in elections versus the left and the right? Like, how do you see this unfolding?
Well, the first thing I'll say is ignore everything I say, because the last time I made a prediction, it was that Trump has no chance of winning the Republican nomination, followed immediately by he has no chance of being elected president. So my predictions, my track record is poor, and trying to predict the future is kind of a sucker's game, because you don't know what you don't know. But let's talk about the crisis we're in right now, this bizarre combination of both a global pandemic, which is a crisis that the world hasn't seen in 102 years, and the political crisis, which is happening not just here, but throughout Europe and the world, from Hungary and Poland and Croatia and to Philippines to Brazil to Turkey, where authoritarian nationalist governments are stripping people of their democracy, and often for similar nativist nationalist reasons. And it's clearly an inflection point for world history. I'm going to forget to tell you this as part of this little spiel, so I'm going to go back a bit. So hold that thought. We seem to be in an inflection point for world history. Now I want to go back a little bit and talk about 20 years ago, a book by a economist philosopher named Francis Fukuyama, and the book was called The End of History.
The End of History, yes.
And his premise was that liberal democracy has pretty much taken over the world. Most societies, the vast majority, I mean, except for like North Korea and China, a few stragglers. We were all in one degree or another in the U.S., Western Europe model of democracy, of social justice, blah 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 blah. And that from the point of view of how the world was going to progress, that was established for all time. It was all over by the shouting. Well, it turns out that nope, it wasn't the end of history, because we've moved as if back to 1930 and the fascist movements of Europe, and we're sort of starting on that path all over again. So it wasn't game over. It's a very perilous path to start predicting gigantic historical inflection points. That said, coming back to this, so now we're in a pandemic where the whole world is in a health crisis. We're also in a political crisis because authoritarianism is reigning in more and more places in the world. And we are also, I would say, in a socioeconomic crisis, not only because we're about to face a world depression, but because the great inequality of wealth has finally, after for the first time since the Gilded Age in the United States anyway, has become of huge political import. It has become a reason for people to rally. So it seems clear that in the event that we get on the other side of Trumpism, and in the event that we get on the other side of the pandemic, there are two possibilities. One is that authoritarianism thrives in crisis, and that fascism will put down ever deeper roots, that wealth will get ever more concentrated into the 1%, into the 1/100th of 1%, and that people will lose their democratic rights. Apologize for the phone. I didn't think to turn it off. The other possibility is, because of the enormous relief efforts that governments have to undertake in the midst of this crisis, the money that is going from governments to individual citizens, not just rich ones, but everybody, and because of the fiasco that has been laid bare in our healthcare system in the United States, we're now 15 million people freshly unemployed, 15 million people freshly without health insurance in the middle of a pandemic.
Wow.
That the catastrophe will be so great that on the other side of this, it will be impossible to deny people their constitutional and God-given right to justice in the society. Which way will it play out? Maybe some places one, maybe some places the other. The only optimistic thing I can say as I look out at the horizon is that I think maybe that even when the Trump administration, to save the country from a plague and to save the economy by stimulating it, is going to have to, it's turning into something kind of New Deal-ish, kind of, sort of,
Yep.
pouring, printing money and pouring it into towards the citizens. And that suggests to me that those needs and that experience may, excuse the expression, trump our trajectory towards authoritarianism.
Right. So you mentioned the New Deal. In fact, I've been hearing that more and more, that there needs to be some form of a New Deal coming out of this. Can you talk a bit about that?
Sure. Yes. This was something that happened in the before times. In the 30s, we had a great global depression. It was, if you lived through the 2008 worldwide recession, if you were sentient being at that point, you'll know times were really, really tough. But in the Great Depression, times were about 3 times tougher, and we had something like 20% or 30% unemployment. People lost their homes. People lost all of their assets. Fascism was created in Germany in reaction to the hyperinflation in the Weimar Republic after World War I, which led to Nazism, which led to World War II and 11 million dead, 6 million of them Jews. And the privation worldwide was enormous. And along the president at the time was Herbert Hoover, who was a conservative Republican, not the modern kind of conservative Republican,
Right.
just a fiscally conservative Republican who always believed that the answer resided in big business and Wall Street and commerce. And he was very loath to act governmentally to try to give relief from the enormity of the Depression. And this guy, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was as elite as they come, won the presidency because the economic situation was so poor. And all of a sudden, he unleashed the greatest federal spending program in the nation's history, created government programs that did everything from electrify Appalachia in the Tennessee Valley, to give jobs to artists to paint murals, to give relief to banks that had to shut their doors, to you name it. And it was called the New Deal, and it was a series of laws that spread the wealth, what was left of it. It created a social security program, a social safety net. And it saved the world. And while it is to this day kind of vilified by the political right
Right.
as being the apotheosis of a tax and spend, overreaching nanny-state federal government, it lifted a country out of poverty. And then by the time World War II came along, 7 or 8 years later, the war production took us over the hump, leading to the greatest period of prosperity the world has ever seen. The United States, from the mid 40s to about 1970, the greatest period of sustained growth and rise in standard of living the world has ever known. So that was the New Deal. And the question is whether COVID-19 is going to yield something similar, because we're seeing bits and pieces of it are already put in place, even by this clown who runs the country now.
Clown who runs the country. Well, we're gonna put a pin on it. We're gonna come back to that because I want to hear more about this. It's interesting because there's noise of this New Deal coming up. What could it potentially look like? And then on one extreme, you have things like universal basic income, right? That's sort of that utopian model. And I've actually discussed this with, CEOs and entrepreneurs. What could that model look like? It's a very fascinating one, but I'll put a pin on it right now as well. One thing that's trending, and you mentioned, World War II that came out of that, the Great Depression, is tensions between China and the US. Well, tensions between China and the rest of the world, quite frankly, right now. And on one end, traditionally, US has been this bastion of freedom. It seems freedom is under attack in the US itself right now. How do you see this playing out with vis-a-vis China and the US?
I don't know. It's in the midst of the pandemic, all bets are off, right? Because China is under siege. The greatest growth after the United States sustained growth in from the late 40s through to about 1970, the greatest period of sustained growth in the history of the world has been China since about, let's say, 1975 till now. And that is obviously has ground to a halt. And the society was quiescent thanks to these ultra police state, and thanks to the growing economy that created a middle class in China for the first time in its 6,000 year history. It was quiescent. There wasn't, there weren't many Tiananmen squares. People fell into line, and uh, the society has worked. But it's a fascist state. I know we call it communist China. Ain't nothing communist about it. It is a modern fascist state, and which with all the repression that implies, and all of the government control of capital and sources of production that implies. And sorry. And it's anybody's question is, now that their economy has ground to a halt, now that they have widespread death, now that for the second time in 10 years, the society has proved to lie even about pandemic, because they lied about COVID much as they lied about SARS a decade ago, which is another form of coronavirus that caused a worldwide pandemic. They have lost political capital among their own population.
So here's
and by the way, they've become more and more aggressive militarily with respect
Right.
to the rest of the world, especially in the South China Sea. They've reneged on their agreements in Hong Kong to let it be autonomous, and more and more and more, the heavy hand of Beijing is influencing political activity in Hong Kong, which is supposed to be left alone. And they're having a tough time, and maybe it will affect the balance of power. Oh, plus our clown is operating a trade war against them at not a propitious time for us or them. So who knows, when we have to pick up the pieces, where the power will reside. It's hard to bet against whatever they have, 4 billion people and a gigantic military and the world's second biggest economy. It's hard to bet against that, but who the hell knows?
The funny thing is, on one end, we're seeing Trump as a clown that he could be, potentially bought out in different ways. On the other end, it seems that he is taking more of a stronger stance against China. And I'm sure there are ulterior motives to that, and we can jump into that. But for example, one thing he is definitely, talking about front and center is closing the borders. And when he decided to do it earlier, on the Democratic side, everybody was calling him, "Hey, you're being a racist. You're being this." So how do we reconcile those two things? If China is a modern fascist state, then it seems like Trump is taking them on, but not so much the Democrats. So how do we kind of reconcile this?
Well, it's hard. First, I'll talk about Trump. What he does with respect to China changes based on the political expediency of the moment. And, they are a very large trading partner. But when he criticizes them, he talks in economically nonsensical ways. He talks about the balance of trade, and he thinks that they're like robbing us of money that we deserve to have because they're selling us more stuff than we're selling to them, right? And he thinks that's the end of the story, but it isn't the end of the story. It's not even the beginning of the story. He forgets, for example, that when they sell us stuff, it gives American consumers, and there's 350 million of them, cheap goods, which improve their lifestyle and means money that they're not spending on other stuff. So it improves America's standard of living, even though our manufacturing sector has been gutted by globalism, especially with respect to China. It has had tremendous benefits for the consumer society. So this notion of them robbing us it's literally nonsensical. And I think he literally doesn't understand. Other times, when he decides he has to look like a peacemaker and a deal maker, he goes to China, and all of a sudden, China can do no wrong. And the president, oh my gosh, is it Lee? is his best friend, and
Yeah.
they're asshole buddies, and this, that, and the other thing. And then now he needs a scapegoat for the Wuhan virus because for COVID-19, he wants to call the China virus, China, because it apparently originated there. And he wants to talk about how he saved America by shutting down the borders. Again, first, when he shut down the borders, he was appealing to his nativist base because he was keeping, people of color out, which always plays well to that crowd. He didn't really shut down the borders. There were lots and lots of traffic going back and forth. And by the way, for the entire month of February, when he was boasting about how he saved the country from the yellow peril, which is the racist term they used to apply to China, while he was doing that, he entirely neglected the fundamental public health measures that we needed in this society, including ventilators, PPEs, work on a vaccine, work on a treatment. He's telling people to use hydroxychloroquine and drink bleach,
Inject bleach. Even better.
He's encouraging states to open up for further spread of the virus. And I mean, what he was doing and what he was not doing were both catastrophic. So I wouldn't call him the guy who has finally called China into account. No. Since Nixon, the American administrations, Democratic and Republican, with the eye of the gigantic market that China represents, because we sell a lot of stuff to them, has kind of zipped its lips about political repression. And just as we have zipped our lips about an ungodly amount of political and religious oppression, repression, and oppression in Saudi Arabia because they have oil. That is one of the worst regimes on God's green earth. And we've been doing business with them since the war because they got something that we need, or at least we thought we needed. Donald Trump is not the guy who has finally stood up
Right.
to Beijing.
It seems like this has been happening, whether Democrat or Republican, it doesn't matter. U.S. support for regimes has been happening for more than half a century now. So it doesn't matter if it's Trump or if it's, I don't know, Obama. Like, it doesn't really matter. This is going to continue. And part of the reason is, I'm going to international relations now, which is self-interest, right? We exist in a world which is anarchic meaning there's no one world government. So you have different states with competing interests, and we've built global governance around it, which basically means how do you operate in this sort of anarchic system with competing self-interest. And then you can have, throw in the realism or the liberals, and there's a whole bunch of back and forth around this. But fundamentally, isn't this just a natural consequence of how the world is structured? Or is the US doing something fundamentally wrong when it comes to supporting certain regimes and so on? Because all they're saying is, hey, I want to take care of America first, right? Our obligation is to provide and protect our national interests. And Saudi Arabia or any other country would do exactly the same.
Well, I'm pleased to be able to answer your question authoritatively. The answer is yes and no.
Okay, perfect.
I mean, let's just look at the Cold War. Now, this is when the Soviet Empire, the evil empire, and it was one, had some number of thousands of warheads aimed directly at us, and had puppet states throughout what was called the Eastern Bloc. They're behind the Iron Curtain. It had then what was then called Czechoslovakia. It had Poland. It had Hungary. It had East Germany. These were vassal states of the Soviet Union, and Lithuania, Estonia, uh,
Yugoslavia, which doesn't exist. So
yeah, the former Yugoslavia, which was sort of a half and half, which we can get into later. But they it was a real evil empire, and there was no political freedom. Quite the contrary. Stalin killed 10 million people, all of his own, all Russians and Ukrainians, and there was what was called the Gulag Archipelago that Alexander Solzhenitsyn named it, to the prison after prison after prison all over the country, mostly with political prisoners. And it was a nightmare state. And we were in this struggle after World War II. We were in this struggle that lasted 40 some years between their form of government and, Western style capitalist democracy. And in fighting that Cold War, where the whole future of the world, the whole world could end in 5 minutes if the missiles started flying back and forth, the United States government made some alliances and some decisions, some of which were horrendous, including overthrows of democratically elected countries and partnerships with states like Saudi Arabia and proxy wars in Africa and so forth, in the name of our fight against the Soviet Union. We did a lot of horrendous things. And so the question is, was it morally just? Well, on the other side of it was an actual evil empire,
right.
With a big body count. On the other hand, we go and let's just say Vietnam, where we lost 40,000 Americans or 50,000 Americans and untold hundreds of thousands or millions of Vietnamese for a war based on a lie, on the theory that communism was going to spread all over Southeast Asia, and if we don't protect Vietnam, well, then what about the Philippines, our ally, where we have gigantic military bases, and what about Japan, another
Right.
ally, and blah blah blah, and you make a lot of bad, unjust decisions for the sake of what is perceived to be the greater good. And the problem, of course, is you don't know at the time whether your judgment is correct. This is called a moral. What's the word? When the sliding scale, moral. Subjective. A common term is eluding me, but moral relativity, is that it? Anyway, moral relativism.
Yeah. Fair enough.
And these are not questions to ask. And in retrospect, decades later, we see we made a lot of really, really terrible decisions. Vietnam being right at the top of the list. And so who knows what our kind of acquiescence to political repression in China, how that will play out over the long sweep of history. But since the world is even if we survive the pandemic, since the world
Right.
has been asleep at the switch about climate change, it may be an academic question, because on top of everything else, the planet is frying into a cinder.
Yeah, and that's interesting, right? How do you solve a global issue with state systems and in an anarchic environment with now competing ideologies and so forth? So let's maybe come back to the U.S. Part of what when you talk to folks like Peter Thiel and so on, and they have a very interesting point of view, which is fair, is that somewhere along the lines, we as Americans lost our way in the sense of building things, building infrastructure. If you go to China right now, and I've been there, I've been on a speed train from Shanghai to Hangzhou, and it's traveling at like almost 400 kilometers per hour. That doesn't exist in the US, the number one, most powerful nation on the planet. And that's astounding, right? I've been to Spain, and they have speed trains all over Spain. Like it's an amazing network. China's put speed trains in Tibet. like up in the Himalayas. So they're building, but somewhere along the line, and this is where, the problem with corporate America and the greed comes into play, is we've been spending too much time taking short-term profit versus investing in the future. And for me, this deeply impacts, my generation as a millennial, and for sure for Gen Z as well, because what is left? But then again, being the optimist, this is where Americans can truly shine. It's just the entrepreneurship is part of that blood, right? Which is, well, now is the time we need to step up and start building and rebuilding, and focusing on that versus wars and politics and all of the other things. And part of the reason why folks like Peter Thiel and there's a few other contrarians, like, that's what they're trying to really accomplish. Now, the different ways, there's the Elon Musk way, right? It's like, forget about the government, we'll just do it, and I'll make preposterous ideas and I'll make it happen. And then there's the Peter Thiel way, well, you need to change the governance around these infrastructures as well.
Including corporate
Of course.
governance, Daniel. You know, to your point, and we were earlier discussing how Facebook, at the end of the day, just does what's best for their algorithm, just best for their business model, growth at all costs, which is best for their shareholders, we suppose. And because the law is built around the supposed fiduciary interests between the company to its shareholders, and their central promise is to increase shareholder value, we have these corporate decisions made on the basis of 90% 90-day projected earnings, which means they have to grow in the short run. The problem is, what I believe is the definition of shareholder value. It's always been measured in terms of revenues and gross profits, and which creates profits on the street. But what's not computed into shareholder value is the health of the planet, the health of the underlying society, the welfare of the other stakeholders, the building of infrastructure, which is needed to sustain the society, and the commercial infrastructure required to continue doing business. If we could somehow get off of this 90-day, I want to see profits now, and define value as something other than just incremental growth, we could unleash the vast amounts of corporate revenues back towards the society to build fast trains, to build a better power grid, to create more green energy, to do these other things that create value in a long term, which also, by the way, keep the world alive. Now that there, keeping the world alive, that there's some value.
I could not agree with you more, and I offer a couple of very insightful case studies on that. In fact, the current capitalist model accounts for these variances. The challenge is the regulation and the implementation of that, and that's a role where governments or any regulation body needs to play, when we're seeing less of that. So I'll offer a few points. What's happening right now, it's very interesting. This COVID situation has also sort of shook me again, because in 2008 we had the banking crisis. The taxpayers of Americans bailed out the banking industry. We gave you $800 billion, and they messed up. Nobody was put in jail. Nothing happened. Now, suffice to say, they did pay back most of their loans, and it was profitable. That's fine, but there was no accountability, and that set a very bad trend, in my opinion. Because come forward to today, what's been happening in the past 10 years is one of the 12 years, one of the largest bull cycles we've seen in a while. Bull cycle meaning the market's been going up. A lot of profit has been generated, and you see this difference. The airline industry, rather than choosing to have this profit be invested in R&D to make more efficient planes, or make more efficient ticketing systems and so forth, they've been doing stock buybacks. And the reason they've been doing that, and again, I go to first principles again, is the incentive of professional CEOs versus founder CEOs are different. That's how they make money. You do more stock buybacks, professional CEOs and boards make a shit ton of money. And so that's what they've
And
been
let's
doing.
explain that. There's a reason for that. When the fewer shares that are outstanding,
Mm-hmm.
the greater the value of everybody's shares.
Exactly.
Most of these CEOs' compensation is in shares or in the options to buy shares at a certain price. When the stock price goes up, they become enriched. So their personal, it is their personal incentive to increase the stock price, not for other shareholders' values, not in the fiduciary interest of them, but rather to feather their own nests. And it's not an accident, but it's certainly an effect, and it does not lead to long-term decision making.
Yeah, and I don't blame the humans. I blame the incentives, because incentives drive behavior. So I don't blame those CEOs because they're just doing what they're trained to do. They're not seeing beyond that. Now, let me offer you another very different case study, and this is about Amazon back in the day, and they have a very famous letter that they wrote to the shareholders, because back in, I believe it was 2004 or 2005. Shareholders were concerned that Amazon is not making a lot of profit, and it's reinvesting whatever profit they have back into the company again and again and again. And Jeff Bezos wrote this very famous letter where he said, well, you know what, if you don't want it, just sell. And all the things have changed with Amazon, but fast forward to recent times, Elon Musk has taken a similar stance with Tesla. He's like, yeah, sure, speculators, you don't want to buy, go for it. Just sell. I don't give a shit, right? But again, it goes back to the incentives. He is a founder CEO. He's built this, and he's not going to put up with these sort of speculation. And he believes, and his focus is on that long-term value. So,
Excuse me, Tim.
go for it.
Hello. Listen, I'm in the middle of being interviewed, so as soon as it's done, I will come over. I haven't even seen your messages. Okay, I'm interrupting a live interview to have this conversation. Okay, sorry.
That's awesome. Don't worry about it. So we have a problem of incentives. So you have founder CEOs who are just drawing the line and saying enough is enough. So it's not that capitalism doesn't allow for this. The question really is, how do we create these mechanisms where everybody is forced to invest in the future? Whatever you do, R&D, things like that. So yeah.
Well, let's just hope we have a future to invest in.
So final question for you, Bob. What would your advice be to millennials and Gen Z, the younger generation? Because we're seeing global problems such as climate change. We've been through the 2008 financial crisis, now a pandemic that hasn't hit in 100 years. And prospects don't look very, they look pretty grim. So what would your advice be? And then we go into elections and governance and all of these issues. What's your advice?
Well, I have one piece of advice with two different reasons behind it. One is to get involved in your community politically, or not politically. I mean, you can volunteer at the library, you can work in the food rescue organization, you can canvass for a candidate, you can run for office, you can volunteer to knock on doors, you can distribute petitions. Get involved. And there's two reasons. One is it's your responsibility. In a democracy, it behooves citizens to participate. Otherwise, it's not really a democracy. You're just ceding authority to people who will make decisions that you're not going to fucking like. And it's your job as a citizen to participate in one way or another. You get to decide what that will be. You can run for president, or you can testify at the school board or whatever, but don't just assume that other people got this, because as we can see, they don't got it. The second thing is putting aside, guilting you into doing your fundamental roles as a citizen, which begins with voting. There is political power. If you coalesce political power among right-thinking compatriots, you can affect change. There was a slogan for the Pennsylvania lottery back in the early part of the 15th century when I was growing up, and the ad said, "You've got to play to win." Well, you do. You got to play to win, and that means you have to vote in your local, state, and national elections. You have to find out what various candidates stand for and whether you're for or against them. And you cannot let the big money that has so polluted, so contaminated, so corrupted the political process get to make your decisions for you. No matter how corrupt the Congress is, no matter how moneyed the special interests are, no matter how much the president and his henchmen lie to you, your power as a voter in the aggregate is greater than all of that. And if you just stand around bitching and whining and talking about, well, maybe a military junta is going to be the better choice, dude, in the end, you got nobody to blame but yourself. So go to the WeThePurple.org, which is a movement, the early stages of a movement to restore faith, trust, and even enthusiasm about American democracy. It's filled with content, both from educators and from media that talk about, remind you where all this comes from and what the stakes are. Because you think things are bad here. Check out North Korea, or Turkey, or Philippines, or Myanmar, or Croatia, or Hungary, or Russia, or China, or Venezuela, or Nicaragua. That's how we say it in public radio. We don't say Nicaragua. We say Nicaragua. Brazil. It's bad out there. We have an infrastructure. Maybe we don't have fast trains, but we have a political infrastructure that is built out, ready for you to act. And you must do that.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Bob. Like that was the best way to like close this. And I just wanted to add folks to check out WeThePurple.org. It's a nonpartisan movement to help everyone just get out there and fulfill their civic responsibility and participate, right? If we don't participate, then we don't have the right to say, I don't like this, or I don't believe in this, and I'm not okay with this. I mean, that's the instrument that the democratic system allows us to voice our opinion, play our part, play our influence. So it's a project that I'm helping Bob as well, and we're both excited about it. So we're going to be talking a lot about that. And Bob, thank you so much for sharing your insights, sharing your stories, and we're going to bring you back as the elections come closer and closer. So I think it's going to be very interesting to hear your point of view, especially for the younger folks who want to understand the why, the what, and the how, but also get perspective from history, what happened before. So thank you so much.
Sure. You know where to find me, Daniel. I'm right here, like everybody else, locked down, curled up in a fetal position. And, just holler. One final thing, if I may. I know you opened this by mentioning the book, American Manifesto,
Yes,
which goes over a lot of these same areas. I am not going to sit here and expect that your viewers and listeners, have to go out and run and buy the book. Obviously, it helps me if they do. It's better for me, but I would, I'm not going to be pushy about it. I will say this, though. If you are moved to go out and buy American Manifesto, I strongly suggest you buy 2 copies in case, God forbid, something were to happen to the first one.
Fair enough. Or I would suggest to get it and share it with someone who you think could also play their role. So we will link the book in the description on the channel, so folks can always click, find it, and learn more about it. I've gone through half of it. I thoroughly enjoyed it, so I highly recommend everyone to check it out.
Thanks, Daniel, so much.
All right, thanks again, Bob, and looking forward to having you here back soon.
I'm ready.
All right, cheers. Bye.
Bye-bye.